Now, look, I want to talk to you this morning about something that happened just hours ago, something that's going to change the conversation about America's role in the world, about presidential power, and about what we stand for as a nation. And I need you to stay with me on this because the decisions made in the next few days and weeks are going to matter for a long time to come. Early this morning, January 3rd, 2026, the United States military conducted a strike on Venezuela. President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were captured, removed from their country, and are now being transported to New York to face criminal charges. Now, you might be looking at that image, Maduro in custody, flanked by DEA agents, and thinking, well, good. He's a narco-terrorist. He destroyed his country. He deserves to face justice. And you know what? Part of me understands that reaction. I really do. But here's the thing we've got to wrestle with together. This isn't just about one authoritarian leader finally facing consequences. This is about how we deliver those consequences. It's about the precedent we're setting. It's about whether we acted within our own Constitution, within international law, and with the support of our allies. And it's about what happens next, not just for Venezuela, but for our democracy and our standing in the world. I've been around long enough to know that every military action looks different in hindsight than it does in the moment. What seems decisive today can look reckless tomorrow, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But first, we need to understand how we got here and why this moment is more complicated than it might appear. Let me tell you something about Venezuela. When I was president, Venezuela was a functioning democracy, imperfect, sure, but democratic. It had the largest oil reserves in the world, a growing middle class, and real potential. Today, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. More than 7 million people have fled the country. That's nearly a quarter of the population. The economy has collapsed. Democratic institutions have been dismantled. And at the center of it all has been Nicolás Maduro. Now, Maduro came to power in 2013 after Hugo Chavez died, and he's held on to it through fraud, repression, and violence. The 2024 election, which he claimed to win, was widely recognized as fraudulent. The opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, had to go into hiding. She just received the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway last month, and she couldn't even live safely in her own country. Meanwhile, Maduro turned Venezuela into what prosecutors have called a narco state. In March 2020, during President Trump's first term, the Justice Department indicted Maduro on narco-terrorism charges, alleging that he used Venezuela's government to traffic as much as 250 tons of cocaine annually. So let's be clear. Maduro is not some misunderstood leader. He's a criminal who destroyed his country, enriched himself and his cronies, and caused immeasurable suffering. The Venezuelan people deserve better. They deserve justice, democracy, and a chance to rebuild their lives. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is important. The question before us isn't whether Maduro deserved to face justice. Of course he did. The question is how we chose to deliver it, who we consulted, what legal authority we relied on, and what happens now. Because the method matters just as much as the outcome, and we'll come back to that. Here's what we know happened in the early hours of January 3rd. Multiple explosions rang out across Caracas, at least 7 blasts in less than 30 minutes. Low-flying aircraft swept through the capital. The targets included military installations, including the FT-UNA military complex where Maduro and his wife were staying. Delta Force operators, our military's elite special mission unit, captured them both and removed them from the country. Venezuelan officials say civilians and military personnel were killed, though we don't yet know how many. Maduro and his wife are now aboard the USS Iwo Jima, heading to New York to face those 2020 narco-terrorism charges. Now, here's something that caught my attention. This operation happened exactly 36 years to the day after the United States invaded Panama and arrested Manuel Noriega. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it was deliberate symbolism. But symbols are one thing, legal authority is another. And that's where things get murky. Attorney General Pam Bondi says Maduro will face the full wrath of American justice. The administration claims Maduro isn't a legitimate leader and that Venezuela became a criminal enterprise. Some supporters argue the president has inherent Article II authority to protect Americans from threats. But here's the problem. The Armed Services Committees in Congress, both parties weren't notified before this operation. There's been no authorization for the use of military force passed by Congress. Senator Tim Kaine called it an unauthorized military attack. Representative Jim Himes demanded immediate briefings and legal justification. Now look, I'm not a lawyer anymore, but I was president for 8 years, and I can tell you when you use military force, especially force that removes another country's leader, you'd better have your legal ducks in a row. You need congressional support, you need allies on board, and you need to be able to explain clearly and convincingly why this was necessary and lawful. Let me talk for a minute about presidential decision making, because I've been there. You sit in that Oval Office, you get intelligence briefings, you see threats developing, and you feel the weight of responsibility to act. I understand that. I really do. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that dealing with someone like Maduro is easy, because it's not. The man was running a criminal enterprise disguised as a government. He was flooding our country with drugs. He was torturing his own people. But here's what troubles me about how this decision was made. According to reports, Congress wasn't consulted. Our European allies, countries that share our concerns about Maduro, are expressing surprise and concern about sovereignty violations. The British Prime Minister had to clarify they weren't involved. The European Union is calling for restraint and respect for international law. Even some Republicans in Congress are asking questions about legal authority. When I had to make decisions about military force Haiti in 1994, Bosnia in 1995, Kosovo in 1999, I worked with Congress. I built coalitions. I made the case to the American people and to our allies. Did everyone agree? No. But they understood why we were acting, what the legal basis was, and what we hoped to achieve. That consensus building isn't just political courtesy, it's strategic necessity, because what happens after you act is just as important as the action itself. And that's what worries me most here. President Trump told Fox News that we're deciding what is next for Venezuela and that we'll be involved in it very much. But Venezuela's future should be decided by Venezuelans, not by us. We can support democratic transitions. We can provide humanitarian aid. We can work with regional partners. But we can't impose a government from Washington. History teaches us that doesn't work. I understand the impulse to act decisively against a criminal like Maduro. But governing isn't about impulse. It's about thinking 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. Now, here's where we need to have an honest conversation about what this operation means for our institutions both at home and internationally. And this is where I get genuinely concerned, because the precedents we set today are going to be used to justify actions tomorrow that we might not like. First, let's talk about our own democracy. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president alone, the power to declare war and authorize military force. Now, presidents have some inherent authority to protect Americans and respond to imminent threats. I use that authority. Every president does. But when you conduct a full-scale military operation to remove another country's leader without congressional notification, without debate, Without authorization, you're stretching that authority to its breaking point. Senator Tim Kaine said, "This represents a sickening return to a day when the United States asserted the right to dominate the internal political affairs of all nations in the Western Hemisphere." Those are strong words, but they reflect a real concern about constitutional separation of powers. When we bypass Congress, when we act alone, when we set aside the democratic process, even for what we believe are good reasons, we weaken the very institutions that make us strong. We set a precedent that the next president can use and the one after that. And we can't just support executive power when our side holds office and oppose it when the other side does. That's not principle, that's partisanship. Now, let's talk about international law. The United Nations Charter, which we helped write, protects national sovereignty. Countries can't just invade other countries and remove their leaders, even bad leaders, without authorization from the Security Council or in self-defense. Yes, the United States doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, but most of our allies do. And when we act unilaterally like this, we make it harder to hold other countries accountable when they violate sovereignty. Russia condemned this operation, and you can bet they'll cite it the next time we criticize their actions. Same with China. Let me tell you what keeps me up at night about this situation. It's what happens next in our own hemisphere. Because Venezuela doesn't exist in isolation. It sits in the heart of South America, bordered by Colombia, Brazil, and Guyana, with Caribbean neighbors just miles away. And what we've just done has created shockwaves that are going to ripple across the entire region. Colombia has already sent troops to its border, anticipating a flood of refugees. Think about that for a moment. Venezuela already has 7 million people who fled the country, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Now you've got military strikes, political uncertainty, potential civil conflict, and nobody knows who's actually in charge. How many more millions might flee? Where will they go? And who's going to help them? Now look at how Latin America is responding, because this tells you everything about the strategic cost of acting unilaterally. Argentina's President Milei, a right-wing ally of Trump, celebrated the operation. But Brazil's President Lula condemned it and warned about the consequences of American intervention in the region. That's Brazil, the biggest country in South America, a country we need as a partner. Mexico hasn't said much, but they remember their own history with American military intervention. Cuba called it a criminal attack. And you can see what's happening. Latin America is dividing along ideological lines, and that division weakens our influence across the board. Here's what I learned in 8 years as president. Democracy can't be imposed from outside. It has to come from within. We learned that in Haiti in 1994. We learned it in the Balkans. You can create conditions for democratic change. You can support reformers. You can provide aid and technical assistance. But you can't just remove a dictator and expect democracy to bloom automatically. It doesn't work that way. Who's running Venezuela right now? By law, it should be Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, but we don't recognize her legitimacy either. So let's talk about what might actually happen now, because this is where theory meets reality. I see 3 possible scenarios, and I want to walk you through each one, honestly, the good, the bad, and the uncertain. Scenario 1 is a managed transition with international support. In this version, the Venezuelan opposition, led by people like Maria Corina Machado, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, works with elements of the Venezuelan military and civil society to establish an interim government. The United States, working with the Organization of American States, Brazil, Colombia, and other regional partners, supports free and fair elections. We provide humanitarian aid, help rebuild institutions, and then step back and let Venezuelans govern themselves. This is the best case scenario. It's what we should hope for. But hope isn't a strategy. And this scenario requires something we haven't shown much of yet: restraint and genuine partnership with regional allies. Scenario 2 is a power vacuum and internal conflict. Maduro's gone, but there's no clear successor that all factions accept the military fragments. Different generals compete for control. Drug cartels, which have been deeply embedded in Venezuela's power structure, expand their operations. Armed groups clash. The humanitarian crisis deepens exponentially. Millions more people flee to Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru. And the United States either commits to a long-term occupation, which nobody wants and we're not prepared for, or we watch from the sidelines as the situation deteriorates. This is what happens when you don't have a plan for the day after. And right now, I'm not seeing evidence of that plan. Scenario 3 is authoritarian continuity with new faces. Elements of Maduro's regime consolidate power. Maybe it's Vice President Rodriguez, maybe it's military leaders, but they maintain authoritarian control. They get support from Cuba, Russia, maybe China. They frame this operation as an illegal American invasion, which strengthens anti-American sentiment for a generation. And here's the kicker: removing one authoritarian doesn't guarantee democracy. Let me bring this home, because I want to talk about who we are as Americans and what we stand for in the world. This isn't abstract philosophy. This is about the kind of country we want to be and the kind of world we want to live in. Look, I'm not going to stand here and defend Nicolás Maduro. The man is a criminal. He turned a once prosperous country into a failed state. He trafficked drugs. He tortured dissidents. He stole elections. The Venezuelan people have suffered enormously under his rule, and they deserve justice. Nobody disputes that. But here's what I learned in 8 years in the Oval Office. How we achieve our goals matters just as much as the goals themselves. The methods we use, the precedents we set, the partners we consult, these things define us. They determine whether we're acting as a democratic leader in a community of nations or as a unilateral superpower that does whatever it wants, whenever it wants. America has a long and complicated history in Latin America. We've intervened many times. Some of those interventions were justified, some weren't, and almost all of them left lingering resentment. People in that region remember. They remember when we treated their countries as our backyard, when we installed leaders we liked and removed ones we didn't, when we prioritized our interests over their sovereignty. And every time we act unilaterally, every time we bypass international norms, we reinforce that narrative. True leadership means working with others, not imposing our will on them. It means respecting sovereignty, even when we disagree with how other countries are governed. It means supporting democratic movements from below, not engineering regime change from above. And it means being transparent with our own people about what we're doing and why. Congress and the American people deserve a full accounting of what happened on January 3rd. What was the legal authority? What were the alternatives considered? What's the plan for Venezuela's future? Who did we consult? What will this cost in lives, in money, in international standing?